Have you ever wished you could live in the Middle Ages? An era where period dramas captivate us with flickering candlelight, lavish feasts, gallant knights on white horses protecting delicate princesses, and majestic castles towering through the mists of history. If your answer is yes, congratulations, you've just fallen for one of the greatest cultural hoaxes of all time. The reality of the Middle Ages was nothing like the movies. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't clean, it wasn't peaceful, and it certainly wasn't glamorous. It was a literal meat grinder. A simple cough could kill you. A meal could poison you from the inside out. And a slip of the tongue could have you burned alive in the town square. But perhaps most terrifying of all, no one thought it was abnormal. Because that was normal for over 1,000 years of human history. And tonight, I, someone who has spent 20 years studying the cultural and social lives of humans from prehistory to the modern era, am not here to lull you to sleep. I'm here to make sure you never fall asleep under the illusion of a time when, if starvation didn't take you, bad breath probably would. So buckle up, dim the lights, and try to live just one day as an average European commoner in the year 1325. Note, this is not a simulation. This is historical fact, verified by ancient manuscripts, horrifying archaeological findings, and a pinch of imagination to help you feel the sting. Chapter 1. You just woke up in the 14th century. Welcome to hell. You open your eyes. The first thing you sense isn't light or the smell of coffee. It's the smell of feces. Yes, cow dung, goat droppings, and human waste fermenting in a wooden bucket in the corner. You're not lying in bed, but on a pile of rotting straw, crawling with insects, fleas, and dried blood from yesterday's mosquito bites. Beside you is your mother groaning from arthritis, two siblings scratching their lice-infested heads, and some distant uncle sleeping like the dead, though you don't recall when he entered the house. There are no walls, no rooms, no privacy. Everyone, humans, livestock, and parasites, shares the same communal space Hollywood would never dare to recreate. The church bell rings, not to remind you to pray, but to tell you to get up and work. It's the medieval alarm clock, and you can't hit snooze. Need to use the bathroom? Head out back, where the bucket is nearly overflowing. Pray you don't step in anything slippery while you're still half asleep. And if you do, don't scream, you'll wake the goat. And that goat might be more valuable than you in this economy. What is privacy? A luxury so foreign it didn't have a name. You sleep next to others, wake next to others, relieve yourself beside others, and sometimes die beside them. Individualism hadn't been invented yet. Everything was communal, even the moans from stomachaches after a suspicious bowl of porridge. You stretch and immediately regret it. Your knees crack like rotting timber, and your spine aches as if you were beaten in your sleep. You're 22 years old and already considered middle-aged by the standards of your time. Life was short, and decay began the moment you learned to walk. Your home, or rather your shack, has wooden walls full of holes. Rain soaks the straw, wind cuts through the cracks, and mold spreads across the ceiling like an expanding world map. You don't know what toxic mold is, you just know you've been coughing nonstop, and every breath feels like a gamble. There's no electricity, no clean water, no antibiotics, but you have faith. And sometimes, faith is the only thing that gets you out of bed, with your bare feet stepping into cold, wet soil crawling with bugs. And that, dear viewer, was only the first 10 minutes of your day. Next, we'll move on to breakfast, which might have you clutching your stomach in prayer. No coffee machines, no smell of toast, only the scent of mildew. Your breakfast, if it exists, is a sad concoction called pottage, a thick stew made from whatever scraps remain from the last meal, which might have been yesterday, or the day before, or back when the neighbor's dog was still alive. Pottage is made from grains, vegetables, maybe some beans, and usually smells like an old sock boiled with dirt. It's not food, it's survival. You don't eat because it tastes good. You eat because not eating means death. Served with it is a rock-hard loaf of bread, made from barley flour mixed with sawdust, bark, or anything that makes it heavier and last longer. Sometimes you need an axe to cut it, or you just suck on it until your saliva softens it like a toddler chewing on a sleeve. Salt is rare. Spices are mythical. The only flavors in your meal are the smoke from the fire and the overwhelming sense of despair. Drinking water, forget it. You drink beer. Why? Because water kills. Wells are full of dead rats. Streams are where people wash clothes, dump corpses, urinate, and pray, all in the same place. Beer, though weak and low in alcohol, was boiled and thus safer. Kids drank beer. Elders drank beer. Beer was the drink of survival. And as you sit beside the ashes, eating your sad mush, you pray not to be poisoned. A little mouse scurries past your foot. You don't chase it. It's looking for food, too. The only difference between you and it, you feel shame. It doesn't want to brush your teeth. No toothbrush, no toothpaste, no floss. You chew on a twig if there's a tree nearby. Otherwise, you just claw at your teeth with your fingers. Your mouth is a battlefield of rotten food, moldy bread, and bacteria. By age 25, your teeth look like a graveyard after a storm, full of decay, gaps, and too depressing to count. Bad breath? Good luck. Your stench isn't just socially unacceptable, it's standard. No one minds because everyone smells the same. You smile without opening your mouth, not out of politeness, but out of fear your tongue might fall out. Bathing? Forget about it. People believed water made you sick. It opened pores and let in evil air. Too many baths meant suicide. Public bathhouses were seen as dens of sin, and the church slowly shut them down. You live with dirt like a second layer of skin. Your body itches. Lice crawl through your hair. Fleas lay eggs in your armpits. Scabies spreads like wildfire. You scratch with spoons, branches, or anything that doesn't bite back. And if someone asks when you last bathed, the honest answer is, I don't remember, but I still had all my teeth. In the next part, we'll get to the meals that kill you slowly, and working conditions that make you wish you were reincarnated as a cow. If you're a woman in the 14th century, my condolences. Society just set your life to survive through submission. Being a woman wasn't like being a princess in a fairy tale. It was more like being born already in debt of body, of dignity, of family honor, and sometimes of life itself. From birth, your path is laid out. Grow up, get married, have children, serve your husband, and die quietly. Weddings happened at 12. Pregnancies at 14 were normal. Love? Sorry, that's a matter for land, livestock, and politics. One heartbreaking case I studied. A girl named Gisela, married at 13 to a man twice her age. By 16, she died giving birth to her third child. The village doctor's journal simply read, Mother died from exhaustion. No one asked questions. No one mourned. Her death was routine. Women were denied education unless born into nobility and sent to a convent. They were forbidden from reading the Bible unless they knew Latin. They were viewed as physically and mentally weaker, a belief reinforced by the church and accepted by men. Especially dangerous. If you were a widowed woman, knew herbs, lived alone, or dared to speak up, you risked being labeled a witch. A woman named Isolde, known for healing with roots, was thrown into a river to be tested. She sank, meaning innocent, but she still died. At home, women were cooks, midwives, emotional laborers, and if strong enough, field workers. In public, they were invisible. In church, they stood behind all men, even boys. Have a fever. No worries. We'll cut you and drain your blood. Swollen glands. That's your body fluids out of balance. A lingering cough, probably caused by bad thoughts. Medieval medicine was a mix of Humer's theory, superstition, and failed experiments. Everyone believed the body held 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness meant they were unbalanced, and balance must be restored at any cost. That cost was often your life. Bloodletting, the most common treatment, was done with dull blades or leeches. Too much blood out? Well, God called you home. Surgery? No anesthesia, no sterile tools. Blades were heated not to disinfect but to cauterize quickly. Barbers pulled teeth. Dentists didn't exist. Antibiotics weren't invented. Germs weren't discovered. When in pain, they prayed. When you fainted, they brought candles. When you were dying, they summoned a priest. When you died, it was said God took you, and the healer wasn't to blame. You think surviving all this was the worst part? Wrong. Death wasn't the scariest thing. Worse was living in a society that used death as a teaching tool. Medieval law wasn't written to protect the people. It was to maintain order for the ruling class. You could be executed for stealing, insulting a noble, missing taxes, or just being disliked by someone in power. One brutal example. In Rouen, France, a 17-year-old boy was accused of stealing bread. No trial, no lawyer. He was tied to a post in the square. Villagers brought food not to share, but to enjoy the execution like a show. Justice wasn't served behind closed doors. It was performed in public, a stage of blood and warning, a form of entertainment. There were even traveling executioners, artists of agony, turning punishment into spectacle. War, domestic abuse, robbery, all daily occurrences. And the worst part? No one truly objected. It was like the weather. Everyone hated it, but everyone lived with it. You walk through the wrong village, hold your wife's hand at the wrong moment, or make eye contact with a drunk mercenary, and boom, that's the end. So, do you still want to live in the Middle Ages? When you sit in a room with lights, clean water, a fridge, painkillers, and the internet, it's easy to say life was simpler back then. But history whispers, no, it was just crueler. The Middle Ages show what happens when knowledge is forbidden, power is deified, and human worth is erased. Yet in that darkness, people still laughed, still loved, still told stories and raised children to be better. They are why you get to learn, to speak, to question. They didn't know your name, but died so you could live fully. So tonight, when you set your phone down and turn off the lights, whisper a thank you for those who weren't given the choice. Never romanticize suffering, but never forget those who endured it so you could be free. Surviving the Middle Ages wasn't a joke. It was a silent triumph of millions of unnamed souls. If you lost power for 2 days in winter, would you survive? Take a moment. Just imagine it. A bitter winter night. The outside temperature has dropped to -5 degrees Celsius. You're sitting in your modern apartment, soft yellow lights glowing, floor heater humming gently, a steaming cup of tea on the table. And then everything goes dark. No electricity, no hot water, no stove, no Wi-Fi. The fridge stops humming. Food starts to spoil. The flashlight dies. Outside, the wind howls, piercing, needle-sharp cold slicing through the cracks. You pull on blankets, layer up with sweaters, but the chill creeps in anyway, seeps into your bones, chokes every breath you take. 2 days without power, and already your nerves begin to fray. Now imagine not 2 days, but 3 months. No electricity, no gas, no running water, no supermarket, no waterproof coats, no modern heaters. And you're not in a well-insulated apartment, but in a mud house with a straw roof and walls plastered with dried dung. It's the year 1316, and you are somewhere in medieval Europe. Cold, in the Middle Ages, wasn't just a temperature. It was a tyrant, a ruthless force that drew the line between life and death, between wealth and poverty. During what scientists would later call the Little Ice Age, 13th to 19th century, Europe was pummeled by brutal winters unlike anything seen before. Average temperatures dropped by just 1–2 degrees C, but that was enough. Snow fell in mid-May. The River Thames froze so thick in London that people held festivals on its surface. But beneath those curious spectacles lay a darker truth. Cold didn't kill with swords or spears. It killed slowly, relentlessly. From 1315 to 1317, Europe plunged into what history remembers as the Great Famine. one of the worst disasters of the medieval era. 3 summers of unending rain drowned barley fields, oat crops, and wheat harvests. Grass stopped growing. Cattle starved. People ate bark, roots, even leather from their shoes. Records from monasteries in France and England tell of people so desperate they resorted to cannibalism. An estimated 5 to 10% of Europe's population, somewhere between 7 and 10 million people, died. Not from war, not from plague, but from the cold and the hunger that followed it. Cold wasn't just weather, it was power. It created a sharper divide than any feudal lord could ever enforce. The nobles slept in stone castles, beside roaring fires, wrapped in fur-lined cloaks. Peasants huddled in mud huts, beside fading embers, clinging to cows for warmth. The rich had hunting dogs curled on fur rugs. The poor, they slept beside pigs in bed, but still they survived. How? Not with technology, not with wealth, but with skill, with wisdom passed down through generations, with unity, and with an unshakable will to live. This story takes you into the world of those ordinary people. People who faced merciless winters with bare hands, unyielding hearts, and communities bound together by something stronger than the cold. From sod homes in northern England to thatched huts in Poland, from frozen fields in Scandinavia to wind-beaten villages in southern France. Their story is a quiet symphony of survival, echoing through the dead of winter. The Little Ice Age wasn't a true ice age, no towering glaciers swallowing the land. But from the 13th to the 19th century, the world grew colder. Just a slight dip, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius across Europe. And yet that subtle change fractured crops, starved animals, and bent the knees of empires. Modern scientists, reading tree rings, ice cores, lake sediments, tell the story. The warmth of the medieval era slowly dimmed. Dark clouds gathered, and the cold began to bite. The cause still debated, but most agree 3 forces shaped this frozen age. 1, the sleeping sun. From 1645 to 1715, solar activity dropped. Fewer sunspots, less heat. 2, the angry earth. Volcanoes like Tambora erupted, casting ash across the sky, dimming sunlight, chilling crops. 3, the changing seas. The Gulf Stream slowed, leaving northern Europe locked in winter's grasp. In the 1300s, winter arrived early and stayed too long. Snow blanketed spring crops. The River Thames froze solid. A London record from 1309 said, "The river froze from November to March. People walked on it like a road." In the Netherlands, frozen canals stopped grain ships. Prices soared. Hunger crept in. And agriculture, the very spine of medieval life, began to crack. Rains soaked the fields from 1315 to 1317. Seeds drowned. Wheat withered. Cows starved. A French chronicle sighed, "It rained without end." Wheat would not grow. Grass stayed brown, and the cattle's skin and bone. In England, up to 70% of cows and sheep vanished, starved or slaughtered. A farmer wrote, "My last cow died in January. I had no plow. And my child no milk." Nobles still dined in stone halls. The poor, they shared bowls of watery gruel. One monk in Germany wrote in 1317, "Lords ate pork and drank wine. Villagers boiled roots and melted snow." But even lords suffered. Prices surged. Armies needed feeding. To cope, many raised taxes. In 1320, hungry peasants rose up, sick of paying for a feast they never tasted. The cold froze more than fingers, it froze spirits. Winters stretched longer. Summers drowned in rain. Some whispered, "This must be the end of days." Churches overflowed. One English priest wrote in 1315, "They no longer come to listen. They come to beg." But even then, hope flickered. Villages told stories of survivors, of fires that stayed lit, of mothers who whispered, "The snow will melt, my love. If we keep the fire alive, spring will find us." And spring did come. Not easily, not evenly, but it came. By the 1600s, people adapted, skated over canals, held fairs on frozen rivers, sold bread, beer, and dreams. But even in the 17th century, winter still tested them. A farmer in Poland said, "We are used to snow, but never to hunger. Every winter is a new trial." A medieval peasant's home wasn't built for comfort. It was built so they wouldn't die. In the villages of 14th century Europe, homes were crude structures, slapped together from the cheapest, most available materials: wood, mud, straw, and dung. There were no glass windows, no fireplaces, no tiled floors. But these homes were the only shield between a fragile body and the brutal cold, between starvation and death. The most common type of rural house was made with a method called wattle and daub. It was simple but effective. Young oak beams, or whatever wood the village had, ash, hazel, dry twigs formed the frame. Flexible branches, usually willow or hazel, were woven into thin walls like fragile webs. Then came the mix: clay, straw, ash, water, and dried cow dung. It may sound disgusting, but once dry, dung hardened like brick. It had no smell and was warmer than any plaster they had. The roof was thatched, sometimes over a foot thick, enough to block the rain and trap warmth. A good thatch could last 20 years, but it invited mice, birds, and insects. Families were often woken by rats scurrying above their heads or bird droppings falling from the ceiling. In 1342, a man from Yorkshire wrote, "There are more mice in my roof than people in the village. Every night I pray they don't chew through it before spring." The floor was packed dirt, cold and unforgiving. Straw or sand was scattered to soak up dampness, but once the snow melted, the floor turned to mud. Wealthier families might lay down old cowhide beneath their beds, but most just curled up on straw bedding wrapped in coarse wool. A mother from Flanders once said, "The floor pulls the warmth from my child's feet." I pile the straw higher, but sometimes all I want is to hold him and never let go. At the center of every home was a fire pit, just a rough circle of stones. There was no chimney, so smoke lingered, soaking the walls and the thatched ceiling. But this smoke had hidden benefits. It drove away rats, dried the roof after rain, and reduced mold. Families sat huddled near the fire every night, not only to cook, but to cling to whatever warmth was left. A woman in Cornwall once whispered, "We sit close like little animals. Sometimes just the flames are enough to believe we'll survive the night." People didn't sleep alone. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens were brought inside every night, especially in dangerous cold. A full-grown cow gave off the heat of a small furnace. A fat pig was warmer than 3 straw blankets. Animals were tied near beds, sometimes beneath them. Children grew up with the sounds of cattle breathing, the scent of dung, and the quiet warmth of animals sleeping nearby. A 1389 chronicle from Norfolk described a brutal winter. The villagers brought all their animals indoors. 4 families, 14 people, 2 cows, 3 goats, and dozens of chickens lived in one tiny house sealed against the wind. Each morning, they shoveled manure and rekindled the fire with yesterday's ash. Living beside animals wasn't just survival, it was life itself. In the cold, anything that breathed mattered. Warmth came at a cost. The mix of dung, urine, sweat, and smoke made the air thick and suffocating. People burned herbs and hung laurel branches to cover the stench, but the effort never lasted. On freezing nights, no one dared open a window. Illness thrived in these cramped homes. In 1350, a village in Poland lost a third of its children to winter fevers, probably from the filth, but people accepted the trade. As one old man from Yorkshire said, "You can live with the stink, you can't live with death." Peasant homes weren't built alone. Raising a house was a village ritual. Some people cut trees, others wove the walls, some mixed dung with bare hands. A young couple's first home wasn't bought, it was given, one beam at a time, by neighbors. The sounds of laughter, voices, and hammering across frozen fields whispered a quiet promise: "You are not alone. There were no locks, no glass windows, just wood planks and animal hides nailed over openings. If a window existed, it was covered with stretched linen or thin cowhide, just enough to let in light but keep the wind out. In the coldest months, families sealed their homes in darkness. Some houses had a small loft for storage or for older children, but it was bitterly cold. Only the strongest or the poorest slept up there. For all its filth and flaws, that earthen home was sacred. It wasn't pretty, but it kept out death. However smoky, muddy, or rat-filled, it was enough. Enough to stop the wind from cutting into your bones. Enough to keep a child breathing through the night. A father in Flanders once said, "My house is nothing but dirt and straw. But when I see my child's breath in the morning, I know it's worth more than a castle." Not every house was the same. In the far north Norway, Sweden, the Vikings built longhouses with great central hearths. Their walls, made from thick wood and straw-mixed earth, trapped warmth inside. Livestock were kept at one end, behind wooden barriers, but their heat reached through. A 13th century record from Norway describes a single longhouse with 20 people and 10 cows, its hearth burning pine and peat around the clock. In the south, Provence, France, houses were smaller. Roofs were tiled, not thatched, but even tile couldn't keep out the cold alpine wind. One farmer said, "Tiles keep the rain away, but not the cold." We still need the cows to stay warm. Wherever they lived, from the icy north to the Mediterranean hills, one thing was the same. The house was not just shelter. It was the thin line between life and death. In Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and Hungary, people dug deep into the ground to store food, and sometimes to sleep, when snowstorms hit. Their homes were built low to the earth, almost hugging the soil, just to avoid the wind. A story from Poland tells of a 10-year-old girl named Anna. One bitter night, when the wind broke through a crack in their wall, she tore off part of her skirt and stuffed it into the gap. That simple act may have saved her whole family from freezing. In northern Germany, where winters were long and cruel, people built an extra layer of earth around their homes for insulation, even though it made the house look like a giant lump of dirt. And in Iceland, where the cold was harsher than anywhere else in Europe, families lived in turf houses, walls made of stacked earth and grass, the roof thick with moss. These homes nearly disappeared into the landscape, but they held warmth so well that some people could sleep without a blanket. An Icelandic farmer once said, "The Earth Mother holds us, keeps us from the wind, but we still need fire to keep our hearts beating." In Russia, where winter could stretch on for 6 months, people built izbas, wooden homes with giant clay and stone stoves at the center. The stove didn't just heat the room, it became a place where children and elders slept, long after the flames died down. A mother in Novgorod said, "I let my child sleep on the stove, for it's the warmest place. Each morning, I check if she still breathes." Women were the heart of these homes. They patched walls, sealed roofs, and kept the fire alive. A wife in Saxony said, "Men build the frame, but I keep the house standing." They rose before dawn to clean livestock droppings, spread fresh straw, and inspect the roof after a blizzard. Older children helped weave fences or gather straw. Younger ones swept the floors or carried firewood. An 8-year-old boy in Sweden once said, "Mother told me to gather clean straw for the bed. I didn't like it, but she said if I didn't, my sister would be cold." Children, with their small bodies, were always vulnerable to the cold. Mothers often stayed awake through the night, just to listen, to hear if their babies were still breathing. A story from England tells of a mother who lost her first child to the cold. From then on, she tied her second baby to her chest every single night to keep it warm. "I didn't sleep," she said, "but I kept my child alive." In Iceland, mothers wrapped their babies in seal skin and strapped them to their backs when they went outside, not just for warmth, but to keep the wind from stealing them away. It wasn't just farmers who kept these homes alive. Craftsmen and monks played their part too. Carpenters shaped the wooden frames, blacksmiths forged the nails and hinges, and masons built stone fireplaces for wealthier homes. In Russia, skilled woodworkers developed jointing techniques that locked timber tightly together, making izbas sturdy enough to survive any snowstorm. A carpenter in Novgorod said, "I don't build houses, I build shelters for souls." Monks, even while living in monasteries, often helped villagers build churches, the only shared shelter during the coldest nights. In France, a Benedictine monk taught locals to mix clay with gravel so their walls would hold longer. He once wrote, "God's house is stone, man's house is earth, but both need human hands." Jewish families, often living in crowded ghettos, faced winters no less bitter. Their homes were cramped, poorly built, and offered little defense against the cold. In Poland, Jewish communities built communal stoves inside synagogues, where whole families huddled together overnight. A rabbi in Krakow wrote in 1350, "Our walls are thin, but our prayers are thick. They keep us warm." And then there were the nomads, the Roma, who had no permanent homes at all. They built temporary shelters from sticks, hides, even snow, moving constantly to avoid the worst storms. A Roma elder in Hungary once said, "The wind is our roof, the fire our walls. We survive because we move." The body needed more energy to stay warm, but the food was running out. Medieval peasants had no supermarkets, no refrigerators, no greenhouses for winter vegetables. Their meals came from what they had managed to preserve from summer: dried turnips, pickled cabbage, pork fat, and barley porridge. Every meal wasn't about taste, it was about survival. A typical winter meal for a peasant family in England, France, or Germany might be a thin barley porridge, cooked with slivers of turnip, a handful of sour pickled cabbage, and if they were lucky, a spoonful of melted pork fat floating on top. Barley porridge was easy to digest, warm in the belly, and kept hunger at bay. The pickled cabbage shocked the tongue awake, helping people forget how empty they felt. And the pork fat, winter's white gold, delivered more energy than any grain, warming the body from the inside out. A story from 15th century Cornwall tells of a mother ladling porridge into bowls for her 3 children. She stirred in a spoonful of fat and said, "Fat is the coat for your stomach. Eat so your belly stays warm till noon." Every bite was a brick in the wall against the cold. On rare days, a scrap of cheese or a sliver of salted meat meant it was a good day. But most days, there was only thin porridge, and that had to be enough. In Scandinavia, porridge was often made from rye or oats, sometimes with bits of dried fish chopped in. A fisherman in Norway once said, "Dried fish is hard as stone, but cooked in porridge, it's soft as a mother's love." In southern France, dried herbs like thyme or bay leaves were added for flavor and digestion. A mother in Provence once said, "I keep a pinch of thyme in my pocket, like a reminder that summer will return." In Russia, buckwheat porridge, kasha, was the backbone of winter meals, cooked with pork fat or dried mushrooms. A farmer in Moscow said, "Kasha is our blood. It keeps us alive when snow buries the village." To make food last through the winter, people salted, dried, smoked, or buried it. Fish, meat, and vegetables were submerged in brine or hung from rafters, where hearth smoke kept them from rotting. Turnips, carrots, and onions were buried in dry straw, hidden deep in earth cellars to avoid freezing. But if the winter dragged on too long, or if rats found the cellar, an entire season's food could vanish overnight. People joked grimly. Salt keeps meat from rotting, but not from rats. A family in Holland lost all their turnips when floodwaters rushed into their root cellar. The mother didn't cry for the turnips. She cried because she knew hunger would come before spring. In Eastern Europe, people dug their cellars deeper, sometimes lining the walls with stone to keep out the mice. A farmer in Poland said, "I dug the cellar so deep, I thought I was digging to spring." In Iceland, dried fish, stockfish, was left hanging outside, where the cold wind preserved it naturally. A fisherman in Reykjavik said, "The wind is our friend. It dries the fish, so we have food when snow falls." A hot bowl of porridge didn't just feed the body, it soothed the soul. On the hardest days, neighbors shared a slice of rye bread, a tiny jar of fat, or a whispered prayer. Food became a symbol of hope, a signal that someone still cared, that someone still lived. A father in Saxony said, "When I split the last piece of cheese for my child, I saw her eyes light up not from fullness, but because she knew I was still here." Every spoonful of porridge was a promise that spring would come. On long nights, when wind howled through the thatched roof, a bowl of fatty porridge was what kept their hearts from freezing. In Yorkshire, they tell the story of a mother who once boiled bark into porridge when the food ran out. "It wasn't good," she said, "but it kept my child alive." In Russia, a common ritual was breaking a piece of black bread before a meal, a silent gesture of unity. A mother in Smolensk said, "Bread doesn't fill us, but it warms the heart. When we share, we know we're not alone." Medieval people didn't know what a calorie was, but they understood by instinct that fat meant life. 1 gram of fat has more than twice the energy of grain or protein. In winter, when the body worked harder to stay warm, chopping wood, hauling water, clearing snow, fat became fuel. A blacksmith in France once said, "A spoonful of lard lets me swing my hammer all day. Without it, I'd fall in the snow." In Germany, warm ale brewed from barley and honey became another source of calories. They called it winter beer, thick, rich, and warming all the way down to the gut. In the Mediterranean, olive oil was used instead of pork fat, but only the wealthy could afford it. A farmer in southern France said, "Olive oil is the gold of the rich. Lard is our gold." Women were the guardians of food. They cooked porridge, fermented cabbage, smoked meat, and watched over every sack and jar. A mother in Flanders said, "I don't sleep when my children are hungry. I count every turnip, every spoon of fat to know how long they'll live." Girls were taught early how to stir porridge, melt fat, and check the food cellar. A 12-year-old girl in Sweden once saved her family by spotting a jar of salted fish that had gone bad, just in time. Children also searched for wild food. In the north, boys were sent into snowy forests to find roots, dried mushrooms, or the last hidden berries. A boy in Norway said, "I found a patch of dried berries under the snow." My mother cried when she saw them, not from hunger, but from hope. In Russia, children were taught to trap rabbits or birds in the snow, bringing home scraps of meat that felt like treasure. Despite hunger, people still celebrated winter holidays, Christmas, the winter solstice, to keep spirits alive. In England, a rare treat was frumenty wheat porridge cooked with milk and honey, only made for feasts. A mother in Devon said, "Frumenty is rare, but it tastes like spring. It tells us better days are coming." In Russia, pierogi, small pies stuffed with mushrooms or fish, were baked for Orthodox Christmas. A grandmother in Kiev said, "Pierogi is small, but it holds our love. We eat it to remember we're alive." In Iceland, hangikjöt's smoked lamb was prepared for the holidays. A fisherman in Reykjavik said, "Hangikjöt is tough, but it's our feast. It keeps us strong for the dark days." Winter clothing for medieval peasants wasn't about looking good. It was about staying alive. They practiced what we now call layering, wearing multiple thin garments to trap body heat. The principle was simple. Several thin layers kept warmth in better than one thick one. The base layer was a snug linen shirt, pulling sweat from the skin. Over that came a coarse, patched wool tunic. The outer layer was a thick wool cloak or fur, strong enough to block wind and snow. Women wrapped themselves in broad wool scarves. Men wore heavy aprons in the fields. Children were bundled like onions, wrapped in whatever scraps of fabric could be found. Clothes were rarely washed in winter. Wet fabric dried too slowly, and dampness could be deadly. The smell of sweat, smoke, and straw seeped into every thread, but survival mattered more than freshness. A story from 14th century Munich tells of a 7-year-old boy, Hans, son of a furnace worker. Each morning, his mother dressed him in 3 layers, wrapped his feet in sackcloth filled with straw, and pulled a wool cap over his ears. Hans later said, "I didn't feel warm, I just felt alive." Wool hats pulled low, gloves made from fabric scraps, long scarves wrapped around face and neck. These were daily armor. The poor wore wooden shoes or wrapped their feet in rags, stuffed with dry straw. In Scandinavia, people even wrapped their feet in dried fish skin, tied tightly with rope. A mother in Yorkshire sewed mittens for her child using the sleeves of her late husband's shirt, as if keeping his warmth alive. In Russia, people wore valenki, thick felt boots made from compressed sheep's wool, warm enough for deep snow. A farmer in Moscow said, "Valenki are my second feet. Without them, I'd have lost my toes long ago." The nobility wore furs, sable, fox, embroidered silks lined with gold thread. But even the wealthy could freeze if they dressed the wrong way. One nobleman in Burgundy fell ill after sweating under a heavy fur coat, then stepping into icy air. He caught pneumonia. Meanwhile, his servant, wrapped in 3 patched wool layers, stayed warm by staying dry and moving constantly. The lesson was simple. Stay dry, stay sealed, stay layered, that's the true coat of winter. Children, with their small bodies, lost heat faster than adults. Mothers spent hours patching tunics, stuffing straw into shoes, wrapping scarves again and again. In Norway, a story tells of a 5-year-old girl who still shivered through 4 layers while fetching water. Her mother stitched a patch of goatskin to her coat, and her hands stopped cracking from the cold. Women didn't just keep themselves warm. They had to keep the whole family from freezing. They wove cloth, repaired every garment, and invented creative ways to insulate, like tucking dry grass inside their bodices to keep their chests warm while nursing. A woman in northern France once said, "I have no fine clothes, but I have enough cloth to keep my child alive." In northern Europe, wool was spun from thick sheep's fleece, sometimes mixed with goat hair for strength. In the Mediterranean, people used lighter linen but layered with scarves to block the wind. In Eastern Europe, fur coats were common, made from bear or wolf hides brought in from the forests. A hunter in Hungary said, "A wolf gave me a coat, and I gave it a prayer." In Iceland, people wore seal's skin or seabird feathers, far more windproof and waterproof than wool. A woman in Reykjavik said, "Seal skin is heavy, but it keeps me dry." And dry is alive. Sleep wasn't about rest. It was about survival. Inside a dirt-walled house, the whole family huddled together on a straw mattress, or sometimes, just the bare floor lined with animal hides. Children were placed in the middle, parents on either side, the elderly near the fire. The human body was a source of natural heat, and sleeping close together meant staying warm. Medieval people didn't sleep in peace. They slept in knots, heads touching heads, legs tangled over legs like a woven nest of limbs. But this mess was no accident. It was strategy. When people slept that close, they created a stable heat zone. They blocked cold drafts. They slowed heat loss through skin. In Scotland, some families even slept standing, backs pressed to the walls of the cow stall, just to steal warmth from the animals. In Russia, entire families slept on the pechka, the giant clay stove that held its warmth through the night. A father in Smolensk said, "The pechka is our bed. It holds the whole family, from babes to grandmothers." No one slept through the night. Adults took turns watching the fire, covering coals with ash to keep them smoldering, a technique called firebanking. The husband stayed awake from dusk until midnight. The wife took over at 1 a.m. Elders woke for the last watch. A carpenter in France said, "I wake at midnight, not because I want to, but because if the fire dies, so will we." Stones were heated red-hot, wrapped in cloth, and placed under beds or inside blankets. Dry straw was packed beneath wooden floors or animal hides for insulation. Some people even slept inside sacks, like cocoons, to trap heat. Sleep was not a comfort. It was a silent battle where every breath was a tiny victory over the cold. In Iceland, families used sealskin pouches filled with hot stones, tied close to the body. A mother in Reykjavik said, "Hot stones are my friends. They don't speak, but they keep my child alive." Children, especially infants, were the highest priority during sleep. They were placed in the center of the bed, the warmest place, wrapped tight, protected by the heat of siblings and parents. A mother in Poland said, "My baby is so small, I fear she won't breathe through the night. I hold her to my chest, so my warmth keeps her alive." Many children died of cold before disease, so mothers woke often, just to check if their babies were still breathing. Medieval children didn't just learn how to survive winter, they learned how to sacrifice. Older siblings gave their blankets to younger ones. They gathered firewood. They slept on the cold edge of the bed. A 10-year-old boy in Norway said, "I sleep by the wall so my sister can have the warm spot. She's little, and I'm not afraid of the cold." And that kind of upbringing forged resilience. A woman in 14th century Sweden, reflecting on her childhood, once said, "Winter taught me to share, to work, to pray. It made me who I am." p. 27. When the firewood ran out, the hearth went cold, and the chill crept into their bones, the peasants prayed. Religion wasn't just faith. It was their final hope. They prayed to Saint Nicholas to keep their children from freezing, to Saint Apollonia for relief from aching teeth, to Saint Barbara to calm the blizzards. Each night, before closing their eyes, they whispered, "Dear Lord, let the fire stay alive until the sun returns." Children memorized their bedtime prayers like the alphabet. "If I go tonight, please take my soul, Lord." Prayer was the rope they clung to when everything else, everything visible, was slipping away. Saint Nicholas protected children. Saint Apollonia cured toothaches. Saint Sebastian guarded against plague. They hung horseshoes over doors, burned laurel leaves in the long dark, and scattered ashes around their beds, small rituals meant to hold off the fear. An old woman in England once whispered into the embers, "I didn't spill the milk today. Please don't leave me tonight, fire." In Russia, they believed the spirits of ancestors lived in the hearth, guarding their descendants against the cold. A father in Novgorod said, "I burn the fire not just for us, but for those gone before. They keep us alive." On the harshest nights, whole villages gathered in the church, not only to pray, but to survive. The thick stone walls held warmth better than the wind-beaten huts. The priest handed out thin blankets and lit giant candles, and families curled up on wooden pews, sharing body heat and belief. A priest in France wrote, "That night, I didn't preach. I just watched them sleep and I knew God was here." Beyond prayer, medieval people turned to songs and stories to keep their spirits warm. In England, folk songs about spring, like "Sumer is Eikumenin," were sung around the hearth, even as snow piled up outside the door. In Russia, they told stories of Baba Yaga, the witch of the woods, to teach children cleverness and courage. A mother in Smolensk said, "I tell stories so my child forgets the cold. When she laughs, I know she'll live." In Iceland, people sang rimmer, long, rhythmic poems during the winter dark, tales of heroes fighting wind and ice. A fisherman in Reykjavik said, "Rimmer keeps our hearts beating when the wind tries to stop them." Medieval people didn't survive alone. Community was the final blanket against the cold. One person chopped firewood, the whole village stayed warm. One family had an iron pot, the entire neighborhood used it. Children were sent to sleep at warmer neighbors' homes. When everything else fell apart, they still had one another. A story from Holland tells of a winter in 1320 when the village had only one cow left. They took turns bringing it into each home, so every family could feel its warmth. A mother said, "That cow wasn't mine, but it kept my child alive." In Iceland, villagers shared dried fish and seal fat, even when they had barely enough for themselves. A fisherman in Reykjavik said, "If I kept the fish for myself, I'd live, but the village would die. We share so we all live." Community wasn't just about sharing food or firewood. It was where the flame of the spirit stayed alive. Stories told around the hearth, old folk songs hummed in unison, shared prayers whispered into darkness. All of it formed an invisible net that caught people before they could fall into despair. A weaver in England said, "I don't fear the cold, because I know my neighbors won't let me die." Even Jewish communities, often isolated in ghettos, pooled their resources during winter. In Germany, they ran communal kitchens, cooking turnip soup and baking bread for the entire quarter. A woman in Frankfurt said, "We have little, but we give all. That's how we survive." Roma nomads, despite their constant movement, built tight-knit communities. They shared fires, food, and stories, teaching their children that the group was their safety. A Roma woman in Romania said, "The snow can't break us because we hold each other." Winter wasn't just a time to survive. It was a time to strengthen the spirit through rituals and celebrations. These customs, from children's games to community festivals, helped medieval people forget the cold and hold on to the belief that spring would come. In England, people burned a Yule log, a large, sacred piece of wood, on Christmas Eve, believing it would bring good fortune and keep the flame alive through winter. A farmer in Devon said, "The Yule log burns for our hope. As long as it glows, we know spring is coming." In Russia, the Kolyada ritual took place during the winter solstice, when children went from house to house singing songs that blessed the coming harvest. A mother in Moscow said, "Kolyada brings light to our hearts, even when the sun hides." In Iceland, they believed in the Yule lads, mischievous mythical beings, who delivered gifts or punishments in the 13 days before Christmas. A child in Reykjavik said, "I leave my shoe by the window for the Yule lads. If I'm good, they give me bread. If not, a potato." Christmas was the centerpiece of the season, a time when the entire village gathered in the church or the Lord's great hall. In France, they celebrated the Feast of Fools, a festival where social roles were reversed. Peasants played nobles, and children were made bishops for a day. A priest in Paris wrote, "The Feast of Fools makes us laugh, and laughter keeps us warm." In Germany, St. Nicholas Day on December 6th was a treasured event. Children received small gifts, often dried fruits or gingerbread. A mother in Cologne said, "St. Nicholas gives my children hope. A dried apple is sweeter than gold." Medieval children didn't let winter steal their joy. In England, they played snowball fights and built snow forts, learning teamwork, endurance, and how to laugh in the cold. A boy in London said, "Snow is cold, but it's fun. When we play, we forget we're hungry." In Russia, children played Snegurochka, a game where they searched the woods for the snow maiden, teaching them how to navigate through snowstorms. A girl in Novgorod said, "I'm Snegurochka and I'm not afraid of snow. It's my friend." Medieval winter wasn't just a test of survival. It shaped the culture, economy, and society of Europe. Survival techniques, from wattle and daub walls to layered clothing, were passed down through generations, becoming the foundation of later architecture and fashion. Religious faith, forged in the cold, became the spiritual core of the Renaissance. Harsh winters demanded innovation. In Northern Europe, advanced techniques for smoking fish and meat flourished, leading to trade networks that stretched down to Southern Europe. In Russia, the craft of making valenki, thick felt boots, became a vital trade, warming feet across the continent. A merchant in Novgorod said, "Our valenki walk the world. They keep German, French, and Italian feet warm." The sense of community sharpened by winter became a defining trait of medieval society. In England, winter fairs on the frozen River Thames weren't just markets. They were moments of human bonding. In Russia, the simple ritual of breaking bread together became a symbol of compassion, echoing into modern Russian identity. Women didn't just hold families together. They were the quiet architects of survival. They organized food sharing, taught children how to endure the cold, and led the prayers that kept hope alive. A woman in Poland said, "I cook, I sew, I pray, but most of all I keep my village alive." Their strength inspired stories and songs, like the legend of Gudrun in Iceland, who saved her people by guiding them through a snowstorm to a fishing shore. In the endless winter nights of the 14th century, as snow buried the fields and wind shrieked through thatched roofs, peasants had nothing but cracked hands, bowls of watery porridge, and each other's faint breath. They slept in knots around the fire, sang songs of a spring yet to come, and prayed for the sun to rise. They didn't know it, but in that darkness, they were writing a story that would last forever, a story of human strength, of a fire that refused to die. Every burning log, every piece of bread broken in half, every embrace shared in the cold was a declaration. Life is worth fighting for. They had no castles, no gold or riches, but they had each other, and that was worth more than stone, warmer than any fur. In those muddy huts under smoke-darkened ceilings and freezing floors, they discovered what it meant to exist, not to survive alone, but to survive together. And today, as we sit in brightly lit rooms, with central heat and stocked refrigerators, maybe we should pause. Imagine the cold stripping everything away, leaving only darkness. Would we have the courage to relight the flame? To share our last warmth? To hold someone's hand through the storm? The answer doesn't lie in wealth or machines. It lives in the heart, where the fire of compassion, of belief, of human connection still burns, just as it burned in snow-covered villages 7 centuries ago. The medieval people left us more than mud houses. They left us a quiet inheritance, a lesson that no matter how cruel the cold, love and hope can still keep us warm. And when the storm passes, when the snow melts and spring returns, what stays behind won't be what we owned, but what we gave: a spoonful of porridge, a whispered prayer, a hug in the night. That is the eternal fire, lit in the heart of winter, and never truly gone. When all modern things are stripped away, will we still have each other? The answer lies in those thatched huts of the 14th century, where people proved that, in darkness and cold, human kindness is the fire that never goes out.